So let's start discussing about the hand instrumentation that you might need for the cavity preparation. These four here, I usually call the Fantastic Four, and they are really handy. They're really helpful for my cavity preparation. They can do things that my burrs cannot, even using slow speed. So every time you're doing any type of cavity preparation, it can be a regular class 1, class 2, class 5, whatever, you need to use hand instrumentation. For inlays, onlays, and crowns, it's exactly the same thing. You need to use hand instrumentation. So again, let me introduce you this Fantastic Four, and why I call them the Fantastic Four, because they're gonna make your prep beautiful in a way that you cannot do using a burr. The first instrument here is the Enamel Hatchet. And the Enamel Hatchet, again, is responsible for proximal boxes on the caval surface margin for buccal and lingual caval surface areas. The second and third one, they are the GMTs, or gingival margin trimmers. And you can see that the GMT, we have a sequence of 4 numbers. You don't really have to, actually 5 numbers. You don't really have to memorize all 5 numbers, but if you take a look at the second number, you see 95 on this instrument here and 80 on this other instrument here. So these two are the GMTs. Every time you have a 95, this is the only thing you have to memorize. 95 is for the distal proximal box. Precisely the distal gingival caval surface margin and the distal axial pulpal angle. This other GMT here, we have number 80, and the number 80 is for the proximal mesial box. This is for the distal, this is for the mesial. Precisely, this is responsible to work on the mesial caval surface margin, gingival caval surface margin, and also the mesial axial pulpal angle. Finally, we have this guy here that we call the hoe. The hoe is responsible to work on the buccal, lingual, pulpal, and gingival walls. This instrument can make your walls look really nice and smooth and beautiful. So that's why I call this the Fantastic Four. You can finish walls, you can make angles rounded, you can remove unsupported enamel, and they are really helpful for any kind of cavity preparation using high speed or slow speed burrs. We're going to keep going, and now using the hand instrumentations as I was telling you before. The first one we are using here is the Enamel Hatchet, and as you can see, the Enamel Hatchet, we have this flat end and the blade, and the Enamel Hatchet is responsible to work on the buccal and lingual caval surface margin. So this is a project that you're going to be doing, a MOD cavity, and as you can see, all the walls, they are divergent. We don't have any convergent walls. We do have the distal and the mesial proximal box. So here's the hatchet working on the buccal caval surface margin. And the hatchet is aid to remove any unsupported enamel on that margin. So I'm working on the distal, now I'm working on the mesial. So what I have now is a very smooth and a perfect line of enamel on my buccal caval surface margin. Doing the same thing, just switching to the other side. Here's the blade of the hatchet. I'm now working on the lingual caval surface margin for the proximal box. And you can see the maneuver I'm doing here is from occlusal to cervical. This is the way to use the hatchet. Moving forward to the mesial. And there you go. So now we're moving forward to the GMT, or the gingival margin trimmer. And as I mentioned before, for this particular instrument, normally we have 4 numbers, and on the second number we have the number 80. And again, just to remind you, when you have 80, 80 means mesial proximal box. If you have on the second number 95, means this is for the distal proximal box. And the gingival margin trimmer is this curved blade, as you can see here, and it is responsible to work on the gingival cavul surface margin over here, and also on the axial pulpal angle over here. So this particular one here is the 80. So let's work on the mesial proximal box. So I'm putting my instrument and touching the gingival cavul surface margin, and slowly I'm clearing that small enamel down there, so you can easily remove any unsupported enamel. Switching to the other side. I was intentionally leaving some powder on the gingival floor, so then you can see the gingival margin trimmer removing that powder. So let's pretend that the powder is like the unsupported enamel. Now the gingival margin trimmer is also working on the axial pulpal angle, as you can see. So if you have a sharp angle, this instrument can make that angle more rounded. Remember, for CAD/CAM procedures, we need all the internal angles rounded. So the mesial box is done, and now we are moving forward to the distal box. So touching the instrument on the cavul surface margin, to the buccal, and now to the lingual. Let's move to the axial pulpal angle. And there we go. What you have now is a rounded axial pulpal angle on the distal, rounded axial pulpal angle on the mesial, a nice and flat and smooth distal gingival cavul surface margin, same thing on the mesial, and the buccal and lingual cavul surface margins are nice and smooth in both proximal boxes. And finally, after working with the enamel hatchet and the gingival margin trimmer, this would be a suggestion for you, even though I'm not really sure if you have in your kit or not, but this is the hoe. The hoe is responsible to make the pulpal floor, gingival floor, buccal and lingual walls smooth. And it's really helpful. Sometimes you have a small little step there, and it's so hard to go back with the burr and make that wall smooth. So what you can do, you can use the hoe. You can see the hole on the blade. This is a very flat blade, and it's really helpful to make that pulpal floor smooth. So applying the hole on the pulpal floor, making sure everything is nice and smooth. Please note that the instrument is also touching the lingual wall, So the side of the instrument is also able to cut. So in this way, removing any imperfections that you might have there. Do the same thing on the buckle. Turning the instrument to this side here, the hole can also work on the gingival floor. And there we go. All the walls are nice and smooth, and you have a very nice and crisp margin on the proximal, mesial, and distal cavity. So I would say now this cavity is ready to be scanned. We are going to just quickly check the measurements here, and I want you to follow exactly the same measurements for your project. So if I put my perio probe right in the middle here on my occlusal box, I'm checking the isthmus. So I want you to keep the isthmus this way here, 3 millimeters. This is not a conservative cavity. This is a little bit larger, so we're not really doing a very conservative procedure. So 3 millimeters for the isthmus. If you check the gingival floor, we have 1.5 millimeters on the distal gingival floor. So 1.5 is the width for the gingival floor in the distal box. And that's exactly the same thing on the mesial box. We have 1.5 millimeters width. The buccal lingual distance for the proximal box is approximately 4 millimeters. The same thing on the distal. We have buccal lingual distance about 4 millimeters. Now let's go check the depth. Let's see if I can turn my model here. Checking the pulpal depth, and as you can see there, hopefully you can see, we have 3.5 millimeters. Yes, it is a deep cavity. Let's pretend that this is a senior patient and you don't have any pulp exposure here, so we do have room to go deeper. Later on, you're going also to discuss about the thickness for the ceramic material. And you understand how important it is to have enough thickness, otherwise you might fracture or might crack the ceramic restoration. So we have about 3.5 millimeters for the pulpal depth. We also have 1 millimeter axial depth, and the total proximal box depth is about a little bit over 4 millimeters. Again, we do have 3.5 plus 1 here on the axial depth, so now we have approximately 4.5 millimeters proximal box depth. That's the same thing on the distal box. You're going to keep exactly the same measurement on the distal box, and the same thing if you're touching the lingual, mesial, and distal cavo surface margin. Please note that here we have enough gingival clearance. So minimal requirement for the clearance would be about 1 millimeter on the mesial proximal box, minimum of 1 millimeter on the distal proximal box. We also need at least 1 millimeter lingual clearance, both mesial and distal proximal box, and 1 millimeter clearance on the distal and mesial buccal proximal area. Why clearance is so important here? If you don't have enough clearance, the optical scan you won't be able to understand this particular prep here, and you won't be able to separate this tooth from the adjacent tooth. Also, clearance will give you room to work with the hand instrumentation. So this is really important in a clinical case. If you don't have enough clearance, you have to switch for a high-speed finishing burr and work on the gingival caval surface margin. Make sure you're going to shave down the gingival caval surface margin. It is important to remind you that this is an inlay prep, and for the inlay prep, all the walls are divergent. This would be the occlusal view for this tooth here, and having this occlusal view, you should be able to see all the internal angles. Again, buccal, lingual walls are divergent, axial walls are convergent. If you ask me why the axial walls are convergent, is because if the axial walls are also divergent, you might have an undercut between the axial and the gingival wall. So reason why the axial walls, again, they are always convergent, about 6 to 8 degrees to the occlusal surface. Let's now scan this prep here, and let's take a look at the computer screen. And this is going to be really helpful for you to visualize and to see what I meant about divergent, convergent, caval surface margin, and everything. So we just scanned the prep on the Cerec 3D machine, and now we have the digital option or the digital 3D model for the preparation. And let's just go over the prep now, and you can see now in a 3D mode, which is really helpful for you to understand the prep that you have to do. This same file we have in your computer, so you can play around and you can follow my instructions here, and at the same time watch the video and keep doing the same thing on your computer using the Cerec software 3D. Initially, what I'm doing here, I'm just trimming the adjacent teeth. So let's remove the adjacent teeth. Gonna double click, left double click on the proximal area. There we go. Let me do the same thing on the other side. Left double click in the distal proximal area. I want to be careful not touching any walls and any angles on the proximal area. Double click again. If you have this ghost image, again, just double click on the tooth, and there we go. So I'm gonna hit next, and what you have now is the opposing tooth. I'm not gonna work on this one right now. So what you have now is the prepped tooth, and let's take advantage of the Cerec software. We can rotate your prep, and you can see all the cavity walls, you can see all the angles, you can see the margins, and you can make sure that your prep is well designed and you don't need to do anything else. Well, let's initially start discussing about the walls. And I mentioned before that for an inlay prep, you need divergent buccal and lingual walls. And what you can see here in this mesial view is my lingual and my buccal walls, they are divergent. So this is for the occlusal box right there. Now let's take a look on the proximal box. That's the same thing. My lingual and my buccal walls, they are divergent. I don't know if you can see on your screen, but let me just put my finger here. These two walls here, they are divergent. If they are divergent, in an occlusal view, you should be able to see the internal buccal pulpal angle and buccal and lingual pulpal angle. Again, if they are divergent, you should also be able to see the buccal gingival angle and the lingual gingival angle. All the internal angles are rounded, and you can easily see here a rounded, very rounded angle. I don't have any sharp corner inside the cavity, so everything should be rounded. The same thing here in the proximal box. Buccal and lingual internal angles are rounded. So I'm going to rotate the tooth. Let's now check on the distal. The same thing. I have a divergent wall on the lingual occlusal box, a divergent wall on the buccal, divergent wall on the distal proximal box, and divergent wall on the distal lingual wall. All the internal angles are rounded. All the internal angles are rounded. If you take a look in the occlusal view for this inlay prep, and I'm going back to the axial walls. The axial walls for both proximal, mesial, and distal, they're the only exception for this divergent thing, because the axial walls, they are converging to the occlusal wall. So you see that this axial wall over here on the distal and this axial wall here on the distal, they are converging to the occlusal surface. Reason why I can see this axial gingival angle right here and this other axial gingival angle on the distal. If the axial walls for some reason they are divergent, meaning you might have undercuts over here. So how much should I make these walls convergent? About 6 to 8 degrees. And how much should I keep the buccal and lingual walls divergent? About 8 to 10 degrees over here. So let's now discuss about the caval surface margin. As I mentioned before, you have a number of instruments to use here, including the Enamel Hatchet and the Gingival Margin Trimmer. This is the proximal box, and you can see here is highlighted in blue the caval surface margin. So for the lingual and buccal caval surface margin, you need to use your Enamel Hatchet, this flat instrument here. So the hatchet is responsible to make this caval surface margin nice and smooth. The other one here is the gingival caval surface margin, and you also want to make sure that this gingival caval surface margin is nice and smooth using the GMT. This is the GMT, the gingival margin trimmer. Remember, we have the mesial gingival margin trimmer and the distal gingival margin trimmer based on the second number that we have on the formulation here. So again, the gingival margin trimmer is always working on these two angles. The other important angle here is the axial pulpal angle, and you want to make sure that this axial pulpal angle is rounded. Again, the gingival margin trimmer, after completion of the caval surface margin here on the gingival floor, is able to make this axial pulpal angle rounded. So again, Enamel Hatchet for buccal and lingual caval surface areas, gingival margin trimmer for the gingival caval surface margin, and gingival margin trimmer for the axial pulpal angle. The other caval surface margin important is the buccal and the lingual caval surface margins. And in order to make sure you have a nice and clean and nice and crisp caval surface margin here, you're going to use the hoe. So the hoe is responsible to touch these angles here and make sure they are nice and smooth. So we do the same thing on the lingual side. Remember, previously I was working in proximal boxes using the Enamel Hatchet and the gingival margin trimmer. Now the hoe is responsible for the buccal and lingual cavo surface margins. The hoe is also responsible to make sure that the pulpal wall, the lingual wall, and buccal wall, they are nice and smooth. So using the hoe, touching the walls, you can make sure all the walls are nice and smooth. Same thing on the pulpal floor. The hoe can also be helpful to work on the gingival floors for both mesial and distal proximal boxes. So using this instrument in this direction here, you're going to remove any step, any imperfection, or any roughness you might have in those walls. But the other thing that you can also check using the Cerec software is the cavity dimensions. Checking the cavity dimensions, you can make sure that you have enough depth, you have enough isthmus, and even you have enough clearance between the proximal teeth, mesial and distal. How do you do that? Using the Cerec software, you're going to click on Window, and you're going to click on Distance. And now we have this new window here on the bottom. Let's put this window here on the top. And let's pretend now I want to check the isthmus distance right in the middle here of my cavity. So what I can do here, once I have this distance menu open, using the left button on your mouse, left click, I have a red mark here. Let's move to the other cavo surface margin. And there we go. You can see now that the isthmus for my cavity on the occlusal box is about 2.95 millimeters. Remember before I was checking with my probe and I had exactly 3 millimeters. So here, because this is a digital model, I can precisely see how much I have in terms of isthmus. Before I was also showing you the measurement for the pulpal depth, and you can also do that using this same tooth. You're gonna check to see how much you have in terms of pulpal depth on the buccal wall. The same thing, click on Window and Distance. Right in the middle here, between the pulpal floor and this angle with the buccal wall, left click, I have a red mark there. Once I touch the cavo surface margin, I'm doing a second left click. So now I can see that between the pulpal and buccal angle and the buccal cavo surface margin, right in the middle, I have about 3.2 millimeters pulpal depth. So remember before I was checking with my probe and I thought I had approximately 3 millimeters. That is no way to lie to the Cerec software. The Cerec software can see everything. So here checking, I notice I have a little bit deeper on my pulpal wall. And you can do the same thing for the axial wall and proximal boxes.